Do you really think that what we do is work? What else should I call it? I should call it the most glorious kind of play.
In the Phaedrus, Socrates tells us that rhetoric doesn't convey truth. Truth is only known through philosophical study. Before we proceed to our study, I must warn you. The secret I'm about to tell you, you're not meant to know. And if Julian ever found out, no one would ever be able to find you. If you fear for your life, please click off the video. If you're like everyone else, you've had questions that have gone unanswered, and when you've scoured the internet for answers, you've been met with some that are unsatisfying, some that are confusing, and what is more often the case, you've left with more questions than when you started. It has often been said that The Secret History is a critique of elitism, that it's a glorification of the aesthetic, that it's satire, that it's a cautionary tale, that it's a story about an unreliable narrator. But I don't think so. I think those theories are wholly insufficient to explain the events that go on in the book. It's not a cautionary tale because they get away with murder, and the way in which Henry departs from this world is described as triumphant. It's not a satire because there is no mocking of the lives they lead. Their lives may seem absurd to you, but I'm sure that your lives seem absurd to them, as is demonstrated by Henry's lack of knowledge of the moon landing. It's not a critique of elitism because being elite or seeking to be elite as a transcendent goal does not bring about the events that take place in the book, nor is it a goal for any of the characters apart from Richard, because they already are elite, and it doesn't seem logically contradictory that you can be elite and be good at the same time. It has nothing to do with the obsession of aesthetics, at the very least apart from Richard, as we'll see later on in the video. Lastly, it's not a story of an unreliable narrator, nor is it told by an unreliable narrator. This user on TikTok has pointed out this inconsistency as evidence of this claim. In the prologue, it mentions that there were 4 people that Bunny saw moments before his accident, but there was in fact 5 in total: Richard, Camilla, Charles, Francis, and Henry. But it's not inconsistent because Bunny saw only 4 people because Henry was hidden in the shadows and shortly after he stepped out of them. I think we can trust Richard's testimony, but not necessarily his interpretation. Let me give you 3 reasons why. Number 1, we should trust Richard because a telltale sign that you're being deceived or being told a false testimony is that a deceiver usually portrays himself in a good light, but Richard tells us that he's a liar, poor, pathetic, alone, and also he tells us about his embarrassing marriage proposal to Camilla at the end. The second reason is because there's no indication that he is an unreliable narrator. For instance, Nabokov's Lolita has the point of view of the story told by the unreliable narrator, but it's also prefaced by an objective narrator. The third reason is an argument. If you can't trust him, then we can't trust anything in the book. If you can't trust anything in the book, then we don't know what the book is about. And if we don't know what the book is about, then we can't say it's a book about an unreliable narrator. It's self-refuting. If these theories surrounding the book don't offer any explanatory power, then what is the book about? I think Donna Tartt is very clear when she tells us what the book is about before the prologue.
Come then, and let us pass a leisure hour in storytelling, and our story shall be the education of our heroes. Plato, Republic, Book 2.
The Secret History is a story about the education of our protagonists. Now, the question is, what is the education? Let's begin. Richard Papin transfers to Hampden College in New Hampshire, where he meets the school's only Greek professor, Julian Morrow, who's very selective of the students he teaches. Visiting his office, Julian tells Richard that he can't take any new students.
Oh, I'm sorry. His tone of voice, incredibly enough, seemed to suggest that he really was sorry, sorrier than I was. I can't think of anything I'd like better, but I'm afraid there isn't any room.
My class is already filled. Something about this apparently sincere regret gave me courage. Surely there must be some way, I said, one extra student. I'm terribly sorry, Mr. Papin, he said, almost as if he were consoling me on the death of a beloved friend, trying to make me understand that he was powerless to help me in any substantial way. But I have limited myself to 5 students, and I cannot even think of adding another. 5 students is not very many. He shook his head quickly, eyes shut, as if entreaty were more than he could bear. Really, I'd love to have you, but I mustn't even consider it, he said. I'm terribly sorry. Will you excuse me now? I have a student with me.
Shortly after, Richard begins to watch for him and his group of students, whom he thinks possesses a variety of picturesque and fictive qualities. He sees 3 of his students working together in the library and overhears them arguing over the precise translation of a Greek text. Richard interrupts to make a suggestion which makes an impression on Edmund Bunny Corcoran. Subsequently, Bunny urges him to
Go see him again, why don't you? Bunny said. Take him some flowers and tell him you love Plato and he'll be eaten out of your hand.
When Richard sees Julian again, he accepts Richard into the class as a student on 2 conditions. The first, he must drop all of his other classes, and the second is that Julian will be his counselor, adding that,
I believe that having a great diversity of teachers is harmful and confusing for a young mind. In the same way, I believe that it is better to know one book intimately than 100 superficially, he said. I know the modern world tends not to agree with me, but after all, Plato had only one teacher, and Alexander.
During that time, Richard notices that there are odd things that seem to go on with the 5 of them that he was excluded from, including Richard eavesdropping on a private conversation between Henry and Julian, secrets at Francis's house like the fiasco with the linen, the boiling pot of almond-shaped leaves that left a rank smell, little whispers, allusions, and coded language. One night, Bunny comes to Richard's room and drunkenly confesses the murder. He hears the same story that Henry told him shortly before. After he leaves, Richard tells the twins and Henry, who plot how to kill Bunny before he can tell anyone else. The next day, Henry says that Bunny will have an accident whilst hiking. Shortly after, according to plan, he tumbles to his death. Bunny is eventually found. The body being retrieved, a funeral takes place as the characters in our novel seem to be on a downward spiral in the spirit of a Greek tragedy. Francis, we are told, suffers from panic attacks, Charles develops a drinking problem, Camilla is abused by Charles amongst other things, Henry suffers from some illness due to his headaches, and Richard suffers from guilt and remorse. As things spiral further out of control, Julian receives a note from Bunny revealing the farmer's death as Richard and Henry are confronted by him. Henry stumbles over his words, attempting to justify himself, which falters in Julian's silence. At that point, Julian says, "That's enough," and hands Henry the letter saying, "I think you'd better keep this." The next day, Julian doesn't show up to class. The Dean of Studies announces that Julian has left. Henry is distraught and is even angry at Julian and calls him a coward. When Richard and Francis go to see Charles, they notice he's been drinking heavily, and he shows them the pills that Henry gave him to help him sleep. But he hasn't taken them because he's afraid that Henry is trying to kill him. Out in the country, where Richard and Francis take Charles, Henry calls and realizes that they're there, and Charles eavesdrops on them, and he thinks that they're colluding with Henry. So Charles steals the weapon and goes to confront Henry at the hotel where Henry and Camilla are staying. Richard and Francis arrive at the hotel first and interrupt a dinner between Henry and Camilla. Then Charles bursts in with the gun and fires as Francis throws wine in his face and Henry lunges at him. Richard is hit in the stomach with the bullet and Henry seizes the gun. He tells Camilla he loves her, whispers something in her ear, and he shoots himself in the head twice. Throughout the whole book, things have been hidden. What were Henry's last words to Camilla? What was the significance of Henry removing himself from the world? I think we can answer these 2 questions by going back to what Henry said at the start of the book.
Of course, we're studying things rather more modern, Plato
and the tragedians and so forth.
Donna Tartt herself tells us that if we want to know more about the ideas behind the book, we should read the Bacchae or the Bacchae by Euripides and Phaedrus and the Apology by Plato. After finishing the book, people have often asked, what's the meaning behind Richard's dream at the end?
I found myself in a strange, deserted city. An old city, like London, underpopulated by war or disease. It was night. The streets were dark, bombed out, abandoned. For a long time I wandered aimlessly, past ruined parks, blasted statuary, vacant lots overgrown with weeds, and collapsed apartment houses with rusted girders poking out of their sides like ribs. But here and there, interspersed among the desolate shells of the heavy old public buildings, I began to see new buildings too, which were connected by futuristic walkways lit from beneath. Long, cool perspectives of modern architecture, rising phosphorescent and eerie from the rubble. I went inside one of these new buildings. It was like a laboratory, maybe, or a museum. My footsteps echoed on the tile floors. There was a cluster of men, all smoking pipes, gathered around an exhibit in a glass case that gleamed in the dim light and lit their faces ghoulishly from below. I drew nearer. In the case was a machine revolving slowly on a turntable. A machine with metal parts that slid in and out and collapsed in upon themselves to form new images. An Inca temple. Click, click, click. The pyramids. The Parthenon. History passing beneath my very eyes, changing every moment. "I thought I'd find you here," said a voice at my elbow. It was Henry. His gaze was steady and impassive in the dim light. Above his ear, beneath the wire stem of his spectacles, I could just make out the powder burn and the dark hole in his right temple. I was glad to see him, though not exactly surprised. "You know," I said to him, "everybody is saying that you're dead." He stared down at the machine. The Colosseum. Click, click, click. The Pantheon. "I'm not dead," he said. "I'm only having a bit of trouble with my passport." "What?" He cleared his throat. "My movements are restricted," he said. "I no longer have the ability to travel as freely as I would like. Hagia Sophia. St. Mark's, in Venice." "What is this place?" I asked him. "That information is classified, I'm afraid."
In Phaedrus, what is discussed is the immortality of the soul and reincarnation. In the Platonic tradition, matter is understood as something that is not true being. The immaterial forms are the true beings. In that light, we can understand Henry's justification for murder.
Henry had become angry when the twins were voicing moral objections at the idea of killing Bunny. "Don't be ridiculous," he snapped. "But how?" said Charles, who was close to tears. "How can you possibly justify cold-blooded murder?" Henry lit a cigarette. "I prefer to think of it," he had said, "as redistribution of matter."
As the body dies, the soul is unaffected and goes on existing at a later date to come back again in another mode. With this, we can understand why Henry commits chop suey and Richard's dream. In the epilogue, Richard describes the moments before Henry's death as triumphant.
I remember his reflection in the mirror as he raised the pistol to his head. His expression was one of rapt concentration, of triumph almost, a high diver rushing to the end of the board, eyes tight, joyous, waiting for the big splash.
And in the spirit in which Julian begins his classes, Henry leaves the phenomenal world and enters into the sublime. The deserted city in Richard's dream is an analogy for matter. In the Platonic view, matter is seen as bad, as empty, something that's imperfect. It's the principle of change. In Richard's dream, he enters a museum or a laboratory, and there's a case where a machine is revolving slowly on a turntable that displays images of famous monuments like the pyramids and the Parthenon. Richard portrays it to be that of history passing by his eyes, changing at every moment. While Henry is there, Richard says that everyone thinks that he's dead, and Henry responds, "I'm not dead, I'm only having a bit of trouble with my passport." He also says, "My movements are restricted. I no longer have the ability to travel as freely as I would like." Henry exists apart from matter in a different, more static mode of existence that distinguishes itself from the mode of existence of bodies in motion. The end scene is thoroughly Platonic. With these ideas in mind, we can answer one of the most asked questions when it comes to the secret history. What were Henry's last words to Camilla? On page 624, when Camilla rejects Richard's proposal of marriage, he asks why not, and she replies, "Because I love Henry." Given the doctrine of reincarnation, the immortality of the soul, and the fact that Henry really does love Camilla, his last words were, "Wait for me." In the Phaedrus, Socrates explains the doctrine of reincarnation. No soul returns to the place from which it came for 10,000 years, since its wings will not grow before then, except for the soul of a man who practices philosophy without guile, or who loves boys philosophically. If, after the third cycle of 1,000 years, the last mentioned souls have chosen such a life 3 times in a row, they grow their wings back and they depart in the 3,000th year. It is explained that lovers of wisdom, the philosophers, like our classic students, are the type of people that it takes 1,000 years to become reborn, as opposed to those who aren't lovers of wisdom. Camilla loves Henry so much that she's willing to wait 1,000 years. Isn't that romantic?
I read The Great Gatsby. It's one of my favorite books, and I had taken it out of the library in hopes that it would cheer me up. Of course, it only made me feel worse, since in my own humorless state, I failed to see anything except what I construed as certain tragic similarities between Gatsby and myself.
It's easy to see that comparison. After all, Richard creates his own fake history on the first page, just after the prologue.
On leaving home, I was able to fabricate a new and far more satisfying history, full of striking, simplistic environmental influences. A colorful past, easily accessible to strangers.
Exactly like Gatsby, he reinvents himself and his past. In the novel The Great Gatsby, Gatsby meets a tragic ending pursuing a woman that he met in his youth. The reason why he never had a relationship with her was because he was poor and a nobody. So, in an attempt to win her hand and steal her away from her husband much later, he becomes wealthy through shady means and invents a story about himself that portrays himself in a prestigious light, which we are told from the testimony of the narrator, Nick Carraway. So, in 2 respects, Richard is like Gatsby, in that he tries to cover up his past and he uses crooked means to achieve his own ends, such as stealing his father's tax returns in order to complete his financial aid papers.
The months subsequent were an endless, dreary battle of paperwork, full of stalemates, fought in trenches. My father refused to complete the financial aid papers. Finally, in desperation, I stole the tax returns from the glove compartment of his Toyota and did them myself.
There's other points at which he's like Gatsby, like the time when Richard lies to Dr. Rowland, the psychology professor, about his imaginary car breaking down.
When I went by Dr. Rowland's office a few minutes later to drop off the Xeroxes, I asked him if he could give me an advance on my work-study check. I walked down the hall with spirits soaring and $200 in my pocket, and the first thing I did was to go downstairs to the payphone and call a cab to take me into Hampton Town. If there's one thing I'm good at, it's lying on my feet. It's sort of a gift I have.
Richard tells us his fatal flaw is his morbid longing for the picturesque at all costs, which has been used as evidence that this book is about the obsession with aesthetics, much like Jay Gatsby, because in the novel, Gatsby buys a property across the water from Daisy, and every night Gatsby stares at the green light that hangs at the end of Daisy's dock. But it's my contention that Richard isn't like Gatsby at all. He's more like Nick Carraway, the narrator of the story, just as Richard is the narrator of The Secret History. First, Richard is the narrator, and Richard is lied to and is used by Henry Winter. Henry, we are told by Bunny, is like Jay Gatsby in two respects. One, he uses Richard. Two, when Richard was inquiring into Henry's background at the dinner between him and Bunny, Bunny tells us some interesting things.
Where's he from? Missouri. He said this in such a deadpan way I thought he was joking, and I laughed. Bunny raised an amused eyebrow. What? You thought he was from Buckingham Palace or something? I shrugged, still laughing. Henry was so peculiar, it was hard to imagine him being from any place. Yep, said Bunny. The show-me state. St. Louis boy like old Tom Elliott. Father's some kind of construction tycoon. And not quite above board either, so my cousins in St. Louis tell me. He leaned forward and lowered his voice. Family's got money like you wouldn't believe. Millions and millions. Of course, it's about as new as it comes, but a buck's a buck, know what I mean? He winked.
Henry is newly rich, and his wealth is speculated to come by crooked means, just like Gatsby. He dies at the end, just like Gatsby. Another striking contrast is the fact that he manipulates Richard, just like Gatsby tries to manipulate Nick Carraway into helping him to meet Daisy. With that, it's time to address the lies. The lies are never big lies. They're always small. Richard admits that he's really good at lying on his feet, but so are the others. It was difficult to spot lies because of how small they were and inconsequential they seemed. For example, Henry lies to Richard about sleeping in a bed. When Henry found Richard during winter and insisted that Richard recovers at his house after being in the hospital, Henry insists that Richard takes his bed.
I don't want to take your bed, Henry, I said. Where are you going to sleep? One of the back rooms has a bed that folds out from the wall, said Henry. I can't think what they're called. I've never slept in it before.
But this is a lie. When Henry reveals what had happened during the Bacchae and the events immediately after it. As you know, Bunny was waiting at Henry's apartment, and that's how we saw the four of them covered in blood when they arrived home.
I was still having a terrible time with the bathroom. Charles's back was stuck full of thorns like a pincushion. For a while, Camilla and I worked on him with a pair of tweezers. Then I went back in the bathroom to finish up. The worst of it was over, but I was so tired I couldn't keep my eyes open. The towels weren't so bad. We'd pretty much avoided using them. But there were stains on some of them, so I put them in the washing machine and dumped in some soap. The twins were asleep on that fold-out bed in the back room, and I shoved Charles over and was out like a light.
We learn two things from these passages. Henry has slept in the bed, and he's not just manipulative, but he actively lies. The second thing that we learn is that it's more probable than not that there were sexual forays between Charles, Camilla, and Henry outside of the Dionysian rituals, because what 6'5" man shares a bed with another man and his sister? Shortly before this lie, Henry and Frances tells us that Bunny has known about the murder since November, before the end of the term, and well before their trip to Italy.
Haven't you talked to him? I said. About 10 million times, said Frances. Has he tried to go to the police? If he goes on like this, said Henry, he won't have to. They'll come right to us. Reasoning with him does no good. He just doesn't grasp what a serious business this is. Surely he doesn't want to see you go to jail, I said. If he thought about it, I'm sure he'd realize he didn't, said Henry evenly. And I'm sure he'd realize he doesn't particularly want to go to jail himself either. Bunny, but why? Because he's known about this since November, and he hasn't gone to the police, Francis said.
The end of the term was after December 17th because that was the date that all the papers were due to be handed in at the college. This seems to contradict Henry's story of how Bunny, when Henry was sick in Rome, translated Henry's diary and found out that he killed the farmer.
I wasn't even angry. I was too stunned. I stared at the translation. It was sitting right there. And then at him. And then, all of a sudden, he pushed back his chair and began to bellow at me. We had killed that fellow, he said. Killed him in cold blood, and didn't even bother to tell him about it. But he knew there was something fishy all along.
I don't think we can conclusively show that this is an instance of a lie, given that it's plausible to interpret Francis when he says that Bunny knows as Bunny has a suspicion. The most damning lie or contradiction is the inconsistency in the details of the farmer's death, which we learn through a newspaper clipping that Charles found in Bunny's room after he broke into it with Cloak.
Mysterious death in Battenkill County. Battenkill County Sheriff Department, along with Hampton Police, are still investigating the brutal November 12 homicide of Harry Ray McCree. The mutilated corpse of Mr. McCree, a poultry farmer and former member of the Egg Producers Association of Vermont, was found upon his Mechanicsville farm. Robbery did not appear to be a motive, and though Mr. McCree was known to have several enemies, both in the chicken and egg business and in Battenkill County at large, none of these are suspects in the slaying.
It tells us that the murder was on November 12th, but this is inconsistent with what Henry tells Richard when he reveals what's been going on behind the scenes.
Then he read a bit of the article out loud. Fractured skull, no murder weapon, no motive, no leads. I was trying to think of some way to change the subject when he said, "Hey, November 10th. That's the night you guys were out at Francis's, the night you ran over the deer." "I don't see," I said, "how that could be right." "It was the 10th. I remember because it was the day before my mom's birthday. That's really something, isn't it?"
There seems to be further evidence that the dates are contradictory in Bunny's desperate note to Julian.
It was unsigned, but there were several clear references which made it plain that Bunny Corcoran, or someone purporting to be him, was the author. It was badly spelled, with a great many of Bunny's characteristic errors, which fortunately couldn't have meant much to Julian, as Bunny was such a poor writer that he usually had someone else go over his work before he handed it in. Even I might have had doubts about the authorship. The thing was so garbled and paranoid, if not for the reference to the Battenkill murder. He, Henry that is, or so the letter ran approximately at one point, is a fucking monster. He has killed a man and he wants to kill me too. Everybody's in on it. The man they killed in October in Battenkill County. His name was McCree. I think they beat him to death, I am not sure.
Is he being lied to? Yes. Is he being manipulated? Yes. Manipulation seems to be a common occurrence throughout the book. All throughout the book, the characters have been shrouded in mystery, and so have their words. Whispers behind backs, whispers on the other end of the telephone, secrets hidden behind certain words, and words spoken in sarcasm and mockery under their breath. For example, when Richard first meets the twins and Bunny in the library, as this person on TikTok points out.
We have all read or know about The Secret History, right? You know, a bunch of pretentious ancient Greek students, whatever. You and I both were like, what the actual fuck? When they were discussing ancient Greek in the book, right? But now I am rereading it as an ancient Greek student, and I'm realizing how many mistakes they're making. Even Henry Winter. Look at this. Επί το καρχιδόνα. Making a tiny mistake and saying καρχιδόνα is acceptable, but το καρχιδόνα, it's a feminine noun. Feminine. Τι καρχιδόνι.
Let's look at the context.
"Wait," said Charles. His voice was a lot like his sister's, hoarse, slightly southern. "Look at this. They're not just sailing to Carthage, they're sailing to attack it. You're crazy. No, they are. Look at the next sentence. We need a dative. Are you sure? More rustling of papers. Absolutely. Epito carchidona. I don't see how, said Bunny. He sounded like Thurston Howell on Gilligan's Island. Ablative's the ticket. The hard ones are always ablative. A slight pause. Bunny, said Charles, you're mixed up. The ablative is in Latin. Well, of course I know that, said Bunny irritably, after a confused pause which seemed to indicate the contrary.
It has been posited that Henry is actually dumb, and that the rest aren't as smart as they seem to be. This is supposedly indicative of the theory that this book is about the downfall that comes along with the obsession over aesthetics and appearances. But I think this idea is wrong, and I think they know full well what they're doing. In this particular instance, they're messing with Bunny by confusing him and insulting him by insinuating that he's a woman. At another time, they do the same thing to Richard as Henry finishes telling Richard the story of the farmer and Bunny in Italy.
Bunny Corcoran, boy detective, said Henry dryly. How did he find out? He wasn't with you, was he? As a matter of fact, said Francis, he was with you. He glanced at Henry, and to my surprise the two of them began to laugh. What's so funny? I said, alarmed. This sent them into fresh peals of laughter. Nothing, Francis said at last. Really, it is nothing, said Henry, with a bemused little sigh. The oddest things make me laugh these days.
This, in my perspective, is an instance in which they're mocking Richard and Bunny by insinuating that they're in a homosexual relationship. There's one more lie. That's the relationship between Henry and Bunny. The day after Richard and Bunny have dinner together, where he tries to trick Richard into paying, we learn their history from Camilla.
How'd you hear about it? I said. The lunch. Bun called this morning, and Henry told us about it last night. I think he was pretty mad. Charles shrugged. Mad at Bunny, maybe, not at you. They don't care for each other, do they? They seemed astonished to hear this. They're old friends, said Camilla. Best friends, I would say, said Charles. At one time you never saw them apart. They seem to argue quite a bit, I said. Well, of course, said Camilla, but that doesn't mean they're not fond of each other all the same. Henry's so serious, and Bun's so sort of, well, not serious, that they really get along quite well. Yes, said Charles. L'Allegro and Il Penseroso, a well-matched pair. I think Bunny's about the only person in the world who can make Henry laugh.
Camilla tells us that they're old friends. Much later than that, where Francis explains that Bunny feels wronged by them for excluding him, Henry and Bunny's relationship is mentioned.
Don't you see? Said Francis, leaning forward in his chair. It's not that his conscience bothers him, or that he feels any compelling kind of moral outrage. He thinks he's been somehow wronged by the whole business. Well, frankly, I thought I was doing him a favor by not telling him, Henry said. But he was angry, is angry, I should say, because things were kept from him. He feels injured, excluded, and my best chance was to try to make amends for that. We're old friends, he and I.
Henry himself tells us that he and Bunny are old friends, but much later than even this, that seems to be contradicted when Mr. and Mrs. Corcoran heaps praise on Henry for his helpfulness during the time of their grieving and the preparation for Bunny's funeral.
This boy, he said, slapping him on the back. I saw Henry's neck clench and his teeth sink into his lower lip. Is 1 in a million. Isn't he a prince, Kathy? He has certainly been quite a help, said Mrs. Corcoran coolly. You bet your boots he has. I don't know what we would have done this week without him. You kids, said Mr. Corcoran, a hand clamped on Henry's shoulder. You kids better hope you got friends like this one. They don't come along like this every day. No, sir. Why, I'll never forget, it was Bunny's first night at Hampton. He called me up on the telephone. Dad, he said to me, Dad, you ought to see this nut they gave me for a roommate. "Stick it out, son," I told him. "Give it a chance." And before you could spit, it was Henry this, Henry that. He's changing his major from whatever the hell it was to ancient Greek. Tearing off to Italy. Happy as a clam. The tears were welling in his eyes. "Just goes to show," he said, shaking Henry's shoulder with a kind of rough affection. "Never judge a book by its cover."
Irony aside, this seems to contradict the premise that they're old friends. What does it mean to be old friends? Is that 5 years or maybe 10? If I was to be extremely generous, we could say 2 years is what constitutes old friends. But they haven't even been friends for 2 years. On the first page after the prologue, Richard tells us,
My name is Richard Papin. I'm 28 years old, and I had never seen New England or Hampton College until I was 19.
He was 19 when he went to the college, and Richard tells us his age at the time of the manhunt.
Have you seen the paper this morning? It was a late edition of the Hampton Examiner. In a column on the first page was a blurry, recent photograph of Bunny, and under it this caption: Police, kin, seek youth, 24, missing in Hampton. 24? I said, startled. The twins and I were 20 years old, and Henry and Francis were 21. He failed a grade or two in elementary school, said Camilla. Ah.
Do you think a year is what constitutes old friends? I would have to say no. This begs the question. Why did they lie about this? What's the purpose? As of now, there doesn't seem to be an answer to this question. It seems as though when we keep digging for an answer, all we get is more questions. But for now, Camilla has been ignored as a seemingly inconsequential character. So let's see what we can learn about her. Camilla has been misunderstood, and not in the way you might think. Richard, in his testimony, has been accused of objectifying Camilla and depicting a romanticized version of her in a sort of feminist critique. But I don't think that's accurate. This is what Richard has to say about her.
Being the only female in what was basically a boys' club must have been difficult for her. Miraculously, she didn't compensate by becoming hard or quarrelsome. She was still a girl, a slight, lovely girl who lay in bed and ate chocolates, a girl whose hair smelled like hyacinth and whose scarves fluttered jauntily in the breeze. But strange and marvelous as she was, a wisp of silk and a forest of black wool, she was not the fragile creature one would have her seem. In many ways, she was as cool and competent as Henry, tough-minded and solitary in her habits, and in many ways as aloof.
It's not as if Richard does present a romanticized portrayal of her, but rather we don't understand her because Richard doesn't understand her. This is a story from the point of view of Richard, and he only sees what she wants him to see. On the same page, he continues.
Charles, kind and slightly ethereal soul that he was something of an enigma, but Camilla was the real mystery, the safe I could never crack. I was never sure what she thought about anything, and I knew that Bunny found her even harder to read than I did.
Although we don't see much of Camilla, or understand her as much as we'd like, what we do know of her, we can figure out her nature and her purpose. She's not a weak woman. She's not innocent. She's not the abused woman. In fact, ironically, she is the most dangerous character in the secret history. We get the sense that she's more important than what she seems, as is expressed by the underlying intuition behind the theory that she's the mastermind, although I disagree. If we turn to page 284, where Richard has gone to Henry's house to talk to them about what they are going to do about Bunny, we find a clue about her character.
Where's Camilla? Charles began to laugh. Francis put down his chicken leg. She's got a date, he said. You're kidding. With who? Cloak Rayburn. They're at the party, Charles said. He took her out for drinks before and everything. Marion and Bunny are with them, Francis said. It was Henry's idea. Tonight she's keeping an eye on you-know-who.
Henry sends her to keep an eye on Bunny. Shortly after, when Richard departs, he bumps into Camilla on her way home.
On my way home through the dark woods, my head down and my hands in my pockets, I ran virtually headlong into Camilla. She was very drunk and in an exhilarated mood. "Hello," she said, linking her arm through mine and leading me back in the direction from which I'd just come. "Guess what? I had a date." "So I heard." She laughed, a low, sweet chortle that warmed me to my heart. "Isn't that funny?" she said. "I feel like such a spy. Bunny just went home. Now the problem is, I think Cloak kind of likes me."
She reveals to us that she's a spy, although she says it jokingly. That's in effect what she is. Earlier, I made the claim that she's the most dangerous character in the Secret History, and I think that's the case because she's able to get behind people's defenses, and she's able to walk across the battlefield and get behind enemy lines. This is especially true with men because women are typically their weakness, which seems to be the case with Cloak. Much later in the book, when Richard's at the Corcoran's family home looking for illicit substances, Cloak and Richard exchange some intriguing words.
"How's it going?" I paused on the landing. Camilla was at the foot of the step, out of earshot. "All right," I said. "What's the story?" "What?" "Better not let Kathy catch you guys screwing around in her bathroom. She'll make you walk to the bus station." His tone was neutral. Still, I was reminded of the business with Mona's boyfriends the week before. Cloak, however, presented little or nothing in the way of physical threat, and besides, he had problems enough of his own. "Look," I said, "you've got it wrong." "I don't care. I'm just telling you." "Well, I'm telling you. Believe it or not, I don't care." Cloak fished lazily in his pocket, came out with a pack of Marlboros, so crumpled and flat that it did not seem possible that a cigarette could be inside it. He said, "I thought she was seeing somebody." "For God's sake." He shrugged. "It's no business of mine," he said, extracting one crooked cigarette and crushing the empty pack in his hand. "People were bothering me at school, so I was staying on their couch before we came down here. I've heard her talking on the phone." "And saying what?" "Oh, nothing, but like 2 or 3 in the morning, whispering, you've got to wonder." He smiled bleakly. "I guess she thinks I'm passed out, but to tell you the truth, I haven't been sleeping all that well." "Right," he said, when I didn't answer. "You don't know a thing about it." "I don't." "Sure." "I really don't."
Shortly after, Richard confronts Camilla about her mysterious call.
"That sounds like Cloak," she said, laughing. "He's really pretty decent, isn't he? Bun always said he reminded him of you." I was puzzled and a bit offended by this last. I started to say something about it, but instead I set down the glass and said, "Who do you talk to on the telephone at 3 in the morning?" "What?" Her surprise seemed perfectly natural. The problem was that she was such an expert actress, it was impossible to know if it was genuine. I held her gaze. She met it unblinking, brows knit, and just when I thought she'd been silent a beat too long, she shook her head and laughed again. "What's wrong with you?" she said. "What are you talking about?" I laughed too. It was impossible to outfox her at this game. "I'm not trying to put you on the spot," I said, "but you need to be careful what you say on the telephone when Cloak's in your house." She looked blank. "I am careful."
We can see little glimpses of her real self behind the facade. She dodges Richard's question by accusing Richard of somehow being at fault for something. But who was she talking to on the phone? It was probably Henry, given the fact that Henry is the leader for the group, and that she and Henry share a secret code that no one else knows about, as we find out when Richard is trying to find Henry to tell him that Bunny drunkenly confessed to him.
"Wait a second," she said, and went to the telephone. "I just want to try something." She dialed, listened for a moment, hung up, dialed again. "What are you doing?" "It's a code," she said, the receiver cradled between shoulder and ear. "Ring twice, hang up, Ring again. Code? Yes. He told me once. Oh, hello, Henry, she said suddenly, and sat down. Charles looked at me. Well, I'll be damned, he said quietly. He must have been awake the whole time. Yes, Camilla was saying. She stared at the floor, bobbing the foot of her crossed leg idly up and down. That's fine, I'll tell him. She hung up. He says to come over, Richard, she said. You should leave now. He's waiting for you. Why are you looking at me like that? She said crossly to Charles. Code, eh? What about it? You never told me about it, said Charles. It's stupid. I never thought to. What do you and Henry need a secret code for?
Later on in the video, I'm going to tell you Camilla's fatal flaw. But for now, the last bit of manipulation from Camilla is her interaction with the FBI after they found Bunny's body.
We stood there a moment or two longer, an awkward semicircle on the flagstones, and just as it seemed that everyone was going to open his mouth at once and say he had to be going, I heard a strange, choked noise from Camilla. I looked over at her in amazement. She was crying. For a moment, no one seemed to know what to do. Davenport gave Henry and me a disgusted look and turned half away, as if to say, This is all your fault. Scioli, blinking in slow, somber consternation, twice reached to put his hand upon her arm, and on the third try his slow fingertips finally made contact with her elbow. Dear, he said to her, Dear, you want us to drop you off home on our way?
She successfully manipulates them with crocodile tears. All throughout the book she goes undetected. I think that she's very manipulative of Richard. She's the person that initially invited Richard to his first dinner at the twins' house, and she's the person that invited him to Francis's house in the country for the first time. She manipulated Richard's affection for her, as well as Charles, in making him jealous of Henry, as Francis reveals to Richard after witnessing their kiss.
They like to present a unified front, but I don't even know how much they care about each other. Certainly they take a perverse pleasure in leading one on. Yes, she does lead you on, he said, when I tried to interrupt. I've seen her do it.
With that being said, it seems that her purpose is to manipulate and act as a spy for Henry. We kind of get the feeling that that's the purpose of all of the characters in the group. And to understand this, I think we need to understand Julian.
By the way, I think Julian's a vampire. I don't think anything of his character makes sense. This is the only thing that's really frustrated me, actually, is because Julian is, like, built up in such a way, but nothing ever actually comes of him. Do you not feel that way? I'm like, Julian is a fucking vampire. He is fucking immortal. Tell me otherwise. I will not accept things otherwise. He is your Dorian Gray. Like, that is absolutely what Julian is. Like, it doesn't make any sense otherwise.
The vampire analogy fits perfectly. For one, vampires are afraid of the cross, much like Julian.
Julian had a polite but implacable contempt for Judeo-Christian tradition in virtually all its forms. He would deny this if confronted, citing evasively his affection for Dante and Giotto. But anything overtly religious filled him with a pagan alarm. And I believe that, like Pliny, whom he resembled in so many respects, he secretly thought it to be a degenerate cult carried to extravagant lengths.
Although I don't think that Julian is a vampire, the original title for the Sacred History was The God of Illusions, and isn't that what a vampire is? They have superhuman, almost godlike abilities, and traditionally vampires have been portrayed as creatures that have no reflection in a mirror. The original title suggests that Julian is the God of Illusions, or Dionysus. We know this because Donna Tartt alludes to that fact at the beginning of Book 2 with this quote.
Book 2. Dionysus is the master of illusions, who could make a vine grow out of a ship's plank, and in general enable his votaries to see the world as the world is not. E.R. Dodds, The Greeks and the Irrational.
Earlier on in the video, we mentioned precisely what the students are studying. Let me remind you.
Of course, we're studying things rather more modern, Plato and the tragedians and so forth.
Euripides, the author of the Bacchae, was a tragic playwright. In fact, the first class Richard has with the group, they talked about the 4 divine madnesses found in Plato's Phaedrus.
The discussion that day was about loss of self, about Plato's 4 divine madnesses, about madness of all sorts. He began by talking about what he called the burden of the self, and why people want to lose the self in the first place.
And the Bacchae was explicitly mentioned during that class. It can be viewed as a sort of initiation for their later rituals. There's some other curious reasons why we should think that Julian is Dionysus in our story. The first reason comes from Donna Tartt.
Could you say a bit more about Julian's role in the story? Because at first he seems very strong and influential, but later on he just moves and he fades away. At least that's what the poser of this question thinks.
Well, Julian in some way is in most ways is sort of the animating presence of this book. I mean, he's where it all begins.
Earlier on in the book, when Richard is heading out to dinner with Bunny, he runs into Judy Poovey. They talk about Bunny and his friend Henry, whom she doesn't like.
I think he's an asshole. I kind of like him, I said, offended. I don't. She parted her hair in the center, using the curved talon of her forefinger as a comb. He's always been a bastard to me. I hate those twins, too. Why? The twins are nice. Oh, yeah, she said, rolling a mascaraed eye at me in the mirror. Listen to this. I was at this party last term, really drunk, and sort of slam dancing, right? Everybody was crashing into everybody else, and for some reason this girl twin was walking through the dance floor, and pow, I slammed right into her really hard. So then she says something rude, like totally uncalled for, and first thing I knew, I'd thrown my beer in her face. It was that kind of a night. I'd already had about 6 beers thrown on me, and it just seemed like the thing to do, you know? So anyway, she starts yelling at me, and about half a second there's the other twin and that Henry guy standing over me like they're about to beat me up. She pulled her hair back from her face in a ponytail and inspected her profile in the mirror. So anyway, I'm drunk, and these 2 guys are leaning over me in this menacing way, and you know that Henry, he's really big. It was kind of scary, but I was too drunk to care, so I just told him to fuck off. She turned from the mirror and smiled brilliantly. I was drinking kamikazes that night. Something terrible always happens to me when I drink kamikazes. I wreck my car, I get into fights. What happened? She shrugged and turned back to the mirror. Like I said, I just told him to fuck off. And the boy twin, he starts screaming at me, like he really wants to kill me, you know? And that Henry just standing there, right? But to me, he was scarier than the other one. So, anyway, a friend of mine who used to go here and who's really tough, he was in this motorcycle gang into chains and shit. Ever heard of Spike Romney? I had. In fact, I'd seen him at my first Friday night party. He was tremendous, well over 200 pounds, with scars on his hands and steel toe clips on his motorcycle boots. Well, anyway, so Spike comes up and sees these people abusing me, and he shoves the twin on the shoulder and tells him to beat it. And before I knew it, the 2 of them had jumped on him. People were trying to pull that Henry off, too. Lots of them, and they couldn't do it. 6 guys couldn't pull him off. Broke Spike's collarbone and 2 of his ribs and fucked up his face pretty bad. I'd told Spike he should have called the cops, but he was in some kind of trouble himself and wasn't supposed to be on campus. It was a bad scene, though.
We can view this as foreshadowing the events to come during the Bacchanalia. In the Bacchae by Euripides, the Maenads, the raving ones, or the followers of Dionysus, were granted superhuman strength, just as Henry is described as having the strength of 6 men. In the Bacchae, Dionysus tries to persuade Pentheus, the city's rulers, to worship Dionysus. In the same way, Julian persuades them to worship Dionysus. In fact, the name Julian is unisex. I couldn't find an adequate source for this, so we're just going to have to rely on thebump.com. Here, it's noted that Julian is a unisex name, and that's relevant because Dionysus is described as androgynous in the Bacchae, as we can see from this quote. Well, stranger, your body is not without beauty, to women's taste at least, which is your reason for being in Thebes. Those locks of yours are long, not a wrestler's then, and they ripple right down your cheek most alluringly. Your skin is fair, a deliberate ploy as you keep out the sun's rays and in the shade, using your prettiness to hunt Aphrodite. Curiously enough, Julian's name means child of Jove, which is Jupiter, the god of thunder, the Latin equivalent of Zeus, which ties into my next point. Dionysus had 2 births in the Bacchae. While his mother was carrying him, Zeus's thunderbolt flew, and in forced pains of labour she bore him, shed untimely from her womb, and died from the stroke of the lightning. At once Zeus, son of Cronos, stored him in a secret birth chamber and concealed him in his own thigh, fastening him with golden clasps, hidden from the eyes of Hera. This suggests that having 2 births means having 2 lives, like Dionysus, who's a god and who plays a character that's not himself. Therefore, we can come to the conclusion that Julian also has 2 lives, one as a classics teacher and the other as a Dionysian figure. Let's take a look at how Julian describes his classroom activities.
Julian's classes met in his office. They were very small classes, and besides, no classroom could have approached it in terms of comfort or privacy. He had a theory that pupils learned better in a pleasant, non-scholastic atmosphere, and that luxurious hothouse of a room, flowers everywhere in the dead of winter, was some sort of Platonic microcosm of what he thought a schoolroom should be. "Work," he said to me once, astonished, when I referred to our classroom activities as such. "Do you really think that what we do is work?" "What else should I call it?" "I should call it the most glorious kind of play."
Dionysus plays a character in his own play, just as Julian plays a character in his play.
Julian, in some way, is the animating presence of this book. I mean, he's where it all begins.
There's more evidence to support this. More generally, the fact that everyone around Richard seems to be putting on an act or illusion in a Dionysian manner. And more specifically, during winter break, the 3rd week in January, Richard was spending his morning with Dr. Rowland doing some work when Dr. Rowland asked him this question.
The rare remarks he addressed to me were cryptic and incomprehensible. He asked me, for example, since I was in the drama department, why hadn't I been in any plays? "What's wrong? Are you shy, boy? Show them what you're made of."
Dionysus is not just the master of illusions, but he's also described as the god of wine or the god of the theatre. Even more, Henry refers to Julian as divinity when Henry and Richard are asked to review Julian Morrow as a teacher.
He had turned to the last page, which was mostly blank. "Please elaborate here on any additional compliments or criticisms you may have of this teacher. Extra sheets of paper may be attached if necessary." His pen hovered over the paper. Then he folded the sheet and pushed it aside. "What?" I said. "Aren't you going to write anything?" Henry took a sip of his tea. "How," he said, "can I possibly make the Dean of Studies understand that there is a divinity in our midst?"
As we can see, this book is thoroughly Dionysian. Or is it? I don't think so. It's my contention that to analyze and understand this book through the paradigm of the Bacchae is a Dionysian Meta-Illusion. What I mean by that is that the book isn't Dionysian at all. It only appears to be. After all, if this book was a tragedy, why didn't the group face any real consequences? And Henry departed this world in triumph. So, how do we understand the book? We might be helped if we turned to Plato's Phaedrus. This dialogue is the most unique work of Plato that we have. In all of Plato's other works, they've featured a whole cast of characters, but the Phaedrus is the only true dialogue, that is, a dialogue that features only 2 people having a private conversation. On the surface, there's a teacher and someone being taught. Phaedrus, someone who loves speeches and rhetoric, has just come from hearing Lysias's speech, a famous orator on giving favours to someone who doesn't love you rather than someone who does. Lysias argues that in a pederastic relationship, a boy should give his favours to a man who's not in love with him rather than someone who is in love with him, for a variety of reasons, but I think this is the most relevant. A lover will admit that he's more sick than sound in the head. He's well aware that he is not thinking straight, but he'll say he can't get himself under control. So when he does start thinking straight, why would he stand by decisions he had made when he was sick? I think you know where I'm going with this.
Bruh.
Further, the lover is jealous and possessive while non-lovers are not. The lover has unhealthy habits that are harmful for the boy. The non-lover, on the other hand, will offer the boy a stable and educational friendship because he doesn't seek anything in return. When Phaedrus finishes repeating Lysias' speech, Socrates says that the speech is poor and that Socrates can produce a better speech. Socrates goes on to say that when a lover's love fades, he breaks all of the vows he swore previously. Ashamed of himself, the lover won't even admit this but instead change his behavior entirely, like a city being taken over by a new government. And this is the interesting part. So now he is a refugee, fleeing from those old promises on which he must default by necessity. He, the former lover, has to switch roles and flee since the coin has fallen the other way, while the boy must chase after him, angry and cursing. This seems to describe Julian. Richard finds Henry in the library after Julian leaves the school, and this is what he has to say.
I closed the door. "Henry," I said. "Henry, it's me." He didn't turn his head. "I just got back from Julian's house," he said in a monotone. I sat down. "And?" "The place is shut up," said Henry. "He's gone." There was a long silence. "I find it very hard to believe he's done this, you know." The light glinted off his spectacles. Beneath the dark, glossy hair, his face was deadly pale. "It's just such a cowardly thing to have done. That's why he left, you know, because he was afraid." The screens were open. A damp wind rustled in the trees. Beyond them, clouds sailed over the moon, fast and wild. Henry took off his glasses. I never could get used to seeing him without them. That naked, vulnerable look he always had. "He's a coward," he said. "In our circumstance, he would have done exactly what we did. He's just too much of a hypocrite to admit it."
If we take this interpretation, it's easy to see the parallels, and people seem to think that Julian Morrow was a groomer according to this meme. Like the lover in Lysias' and Socrates' speech, Julian is harmful for the beloved or student and leads him astray both in the cultivation of the soul and body. And like the lover, Julian is possessive of his beloved given the fact that one of the requirements is that he is the only teacher that they have, and he's also their counselor, having complete control and knowledge over their psychology. Julian Morrow gains his wits about him as he sees the fruits of his teaching, and he promptly flees. So, we've learned that the book is not in fact Dionysian, but it's Platonic. Or is it? I don't think so. I think we've been fooled, much like Richard.
I mean, this is also what the book is about in a lot of respects, is the difference between appearance and reality, because nothing in this book is really what it seems, you know. Mm-hmm. The narrator is fooled again and again, or is deluded again and again.
There's an interesting clue that we find in the book which comes from Francis of all people, who I don't think is particularly interesting. Feel free to leave hate comments and death threats, okay? I don't care. He's boring. Judy Poovey is a way better character, but I digress. Earlier in the video, we talked about the multiple instances of lying and of them making fun of people, such as insinuating that Richard's a homosexual. But there's another instance which is perhaps the most interesting and the most revealing about the nature of our characters. In chapter 6, Bunny has been missing and Cloak is worried because he suspects that Bunny has gone down to New York to make some money with some drug traffickers. He suspects this because Bunny is usually broke and he's noticed that Bunny has money and new clothes thanks to Henry. He worries that Bunny may have gotten himself into trouble and things went sideways. Henry asks Cloak if he can get in touch with them.
Who am I going to call? The guy's unlisted and he doesn't hand out business cards, all right? Then how do you get in touch with him? I have to call a third guy. Then call him, said Henry calmly. putting the handkerchief back in his pocket and hooking the glasses back over his ears. "They're not going to tell me anything. I thought they were such good chums of yours." "What do you think?" said Cloak. "You think these people are running some kind of a scout troop down there? Are you kidding? These are real guys, doing real shit." For one horrible instant I thought that Francis was going to laugh aloud, but somehow he managed to turn it into a theatrical battery of coughs, hiding his face behind his hand. With barely a glance, Henry slapped him hard on the back.
You may ask, in what way is this revealing? Well, when Cloak says that these guys are legitimate and they're into some serious criminal activities, Francis's first impulse is to laugh. Why is that? Because he can't take Cloak seriously. And why can't he take Cloak seriously? It's not as though we've seen any indication that Cloak is an unserious character. There seems to be only one possible reason. Running a drug trafficking operation is petty criminal activity compared to the class of criminals that Francis is a part of. One may be tempted to reply that maybe it's true that Francis regards those criminal activities as petty because Francis was involved in 2 murders. But it doesn't seem like a legitimate criticism because I'm sure that these drug traffickers have their fair share of murder on their rap sheets as well. So it must be the case that Francis is in fact a part of a class of criminals far above that of drug traffickers, perhaps a class that controls money. Curiously enough, Bunny's father works as a president for a bank. He tells us this when he and Richard are out to dinner when Richard lies about his family owning an oil well.
"Meant to ask, how does your pop earn his filthy lucre?"
"Oil," I said. It was partly true. Bunny's mouth fell open in a little round O.
"You have oil wells?"
"Well, we have one," I said modestly.
"But it's a good one."
"So they tell me." "Why," said Bunny, shaking his head.
"The Golden West."
"It's been good to us," I said.
"Geez," Bunny said, "my dad's just a lousy old bank president."
After Bunny's funeral at the church, when they leave for the cars, we learn that the person that owns the controlling interest of the bank that Bunny's father works for attends Bunny's funeral.
Up ahead, the pallbearers, Henry indistinct, somewhere among them, were sliding the casket into the open doors of the hearse. "Dad," said Hugh. He was tremendously agitated. "Dad, you gotta listen to me for a sec." The doors slammed. Slowly, Mr. Corcoran turned. He was carrying the baby they called Champ, but today its presence seemed to offer him little comfort. The expression on his big, slack face was haunted and lost. He stared at his son as if he had never seen him before. "Dad," said Hugh, "guess who I just saw? Guess who came?" "Mr. Vanderfeller," he said urgently, pressing his father's arm. The syllables of this illustrious name, one which the Corcorans invoked with very nearly as much respect as that of Christ Almighty, had, when uttered aloud, a miraculous effect of healing on Mr. Corcoran. "Vanderfeller's here?" he said, looking around. "Where?" This august personage, who loomed large in the collective unconscious of the Corcorans, was the head of a charitable foundation, endowed by his even more august grandpapa, which happened to own a controlling interest in the stock of Mr. Corcoran's bank. This entailed board meetings and occasional social functions, and the Corcorans had an endless store of delightful anecdotes about Paul Vanderfeller, of how European he was, what a celebrated wit, and though the witticisms they found frequent occasion to repeat seemed poor things to me, the guards up at the security booth at Hampton were cleverer. They made the Corcorans rock with urbane and apparently quite sincere laughter. One of Bunny's favorite ways to start a sentence had been to let drop, quite casually, "When Dad was lunching with Paul Vanderfeller the other day."
We learn 2 things at the funeral and burial. The first is that the only pretentious character in the secret history is Bunny because of his shameless name-dropping, his absurd paper on Meta-Illusion, and, of course, his supposed 200-year-old artwork.
I reached up and carefully took a framed Japanese print from the wall and laid it down on his desk. "Don't touch that," he shouted, dropping his nightstand drawer on the floor with a bang and darting over to snatch up the print. "That thing's 200 years old." As a matter of fact, I knew that it was no such thing, since I happened a few weeks before to have seen him carefully razoring it from a book in the library. I said nothing, but I was so irritated that I left immediately, amidst what gruff excuses his pride permitted him.
Digression aside, the second but most important thing we learn is at the burial of Bunny.
Julian was there, which was something of a blessing. He drifted through the party like a good angel, making graceful small talk, knowing exactly the right thing to say to everyone, and behaving with such heavenly charm and diplomacy toward the Corcorans, whom he in fact disliked, and vice versa, that even Mrs. Corcoran was mollified. Besides, the pinnacle of glory as far as the Corcorans were concerned, it turned out that he was an old acquaintance of Paul Vanderfeller's, and Francis, who happened to be nearby, said he hoped he never forgot the expression on Mr. Corcoran's face when Vanderfeller recognized Julian and greeted him, European style, as Mrs. Corcoran was heard explaining to a neighbor, with an embrace and a kiss on the cheek.
The second thing we learn is that Julian is connected to someone who controls money. Julian is connected to someone who comes from the ruling class, and Bunny's family is at the level of the managerial class. All throughout the book, Julian has been mentioned in conjunction with other elites. When Richard stays over at Henry's house at his insistence upon leaving the hospital, Richard finds a black and white picture from a Life magazine on Henry's closet door.
Tacked on the closet door was a black and white picture from an old magazine. Life, it said, 1945. It was of Vivian Lee, and, surprisingly, a much younger Julian. They were at a cocktail party, glasses in hand. He was whispering something in her ear, and she was laughing. "Where was that taken?" I said. "I don't know. Julian says he can't remember. Every now and then one runs across a photograph of him in an old magazine." "Why?" "He used to know a lot of people." "Who?" "Most of them are dead now." "Who?" "I really don't know, Richard." Then, relenting, "I've seen pictures of him with the Sitwells and T.S. Eliot. Also, there's rather a funny one of him with that actress. I can't remember her name. She's dead now." He thought for a minute. "She was blonde," he said. "I think she was married to a baseball player." "Marilyn Monroe?" "Maybe. It wasn't a very good picture, only newsprint."
In fact, Julian once taught a princess.
"By the way, did I tell you that some men came round to see me yesterday afternoon?"
"Who were they?"
"There were 2 of them. At first I was rather anxious. I thought they were from the State Department, or worse. You've heard of my problems with the Islami government."
I am not sure what Julian thought the Islami government, terrorist state though it is, should want to do with him, but his fear of it came from his having taught its exiled crown princess about 10 years before. After the revolution, she'd been forced into hiding, had ended up somehow at Hampton College. Julian taught her for 4 years, in private tutorials supervised by the former Islami Minister of Education, who would occasionally fly in from Switzerland with gifts of caviar and chocolates to make sure that the curriculum was suitable for the heir apparent to his country's throne.
Julian is connected with one of the best doctors in the world.
"You know, I was at the doctor's today. I waited for him to go on. He didn't. 'What for?' I finally said. 'Same stuff. Dizziness, chest pains. I wake up in the night and can't get my breath. Last week I went back to the hospital and let them run some tests, but nothing turned up. They referred me to this other fellow, a neurologist. And?' He shifted restlessly in his chair. 'He didn't find anything. None of these hick doctors are any good. Julian gave me the name of a man in New York. He was the one who cured the Shah of Islam, you know, of that blood disease. It was in all the papers. Julian says he's the best diagnostician in the country and one of the best in the world. He's booked 2 years in advance, but Julian says maybe if he calls him, he might agree to see me.'
The hotel that Henry stays at with Camilla the Albemarle, was used by Franklin D. Roosevelt. It's becoming more and more apparent that Hamden is a secret place for teaching the youth of the elite.
The Albemarle had been built in the 19th century as a retreat for rich convalescents. It was shady and luxurious, with tall shutters and a big cool porch. Everyone from Rudyard Kipling to FDR had stayed there. But it wasn't much bigger than a big private house.
How does Julian know these people? We get a clue as to how on page 268.
Julian, on special occasions, sometimes had lunches for the class. He was an excellent cook, and, when he was a young man living off his trust fund in Europe, had the reputation of being an excellent host as well. This was, in fact, the basis of his acquaintance with most of the famous people in his life.
I also have to mention that being a host is symbolic of Dionysus, who was of course leading the Maenads as they feasted on animals, and Pentheus. The earliest place that his connections to the elite was mentioned on page 16.
Nearly everyone had heard of him, and I was given all sorts of contradictory but fascinating information. That he was a brilliant man, that he was a fraud, that he had no college degree, that he had been a great intellectual in the 40s, and a friend to Ezra Pound and T.S. Eliot, that his family money had come from a partnership in a white shoe banking firm, or, conversely, from the purchase of foreclosed property during the Depression, that he had dodged the draft in some war, though chronologically this was difficult to compute, that he had ties with the Vatican, a deposed royal family in the Middle East, Franco's Spain. The degree of truth in any of this was, of course, unknowable, but the more I heard about him, the more interested I became, and I began to watch for him and his little group of pupils around campus.
There's no reason to say that all of this isn't true. After all, there doesn't actually seem to be a contradiction here. You can be a fraud, have no degree, and be friends with T.S. Eliot simultaneously. It might be objected that you need a degree to teach, but Plato and Aristotle were the greatest teachers in history, and they didn't have a degree. From all of this, we can deduce that Julian's purpose in the book is to teach the children of the elite. And Bunny says something that is symbolic of that.
I have thought a great deal about this passage, also about a particularly shrewd remark once made by, of all people, Bunny. "You know," he said, "Julian is like one of those people that'll pick all his favorite chocolates out of the box and leave the rest." This seems rather enigmatic on the face of it, but actually I cannot think of a better metaphor for Julian's personality.
Julian takes the few that are, in his opinion, worth it and disposes of the rest. This is an analogy for the elite and those beneath them. So, what have we learned so far? We've learned that this book is not Dionysian, it's not Platonic, and we've learned that Julian is connected with the elite. At the start of the video, I pointed out that Donna Tartt tells us that this book is about the education of our heroes. But what is that education? From what we've learned so far, I don't think we can answer that just yet. But every education comes with a test. But I don't think there was any explicit mention of a test. If we can find out what the test is, we can understand what the education is. And to find out what the test is, I think we have to return to the Phaedrus. We talked a little about the Phaedrus in our chapter on the Dionysian Meta-Illusion, where we noted that Phaedrus and Socrates each tell a speech about whether a young boy should give his favours to a lover or the non-lover, with both arguing in favour for the non-lover. Shortly after Socrates gives his speech against the lover, the little voice in his head, or his daemon, warns him that he's committed an act of blasphemy. He then sets out to redeem himself by giving us a palinode, which is a poem in which a poet retracts a view expressed in a former poem. The reason why he thinks that he's committed an impious act is because love, or eros, is the son of Aphrodite and therefore one of the gods. And if love is divine, then something divine cannot be bad in any way. In his palinode, he goes on to argue that madness, or love, or eros, is good if it is a gift from the gods, and this is where the four divine madnesses mentioned in the Secret History comes in. The first type of madness is the gift of prophecy from Apollo. The second type of madness is the gift of love from Aphrodite. The third type of madness is the gift of poetry from the muses. The last and most important is the madness given to us as a gift from Dionysus. This explains why Henry felt no remorse for the farmer or bunny. The madness that our characters were endowed with was a gift from the god Dionysus, and so the act that they committed cannot be said to be wrong. But, as we've already noted, this book isn't Dionysian. So, let's continue with the dialogue. After Socrates gives us his palinode, the dialogue transitions to a discussion of rhetoric. Phaedrus takes the view that truth doesn't matter in speech. Socrates argues against this position. Phaedrus: what I have actually heard about this, Socrates, my friend, is that it is not necessary for the intending orator to learn what is really just, but only what will seem just to the crowd who will act as judges, nor again what is really good or noble, but only what will seem so, for that is what persuasion proceeds from, not truth. Arguing against this position, Socrates offers a hypothetical situation in which you went to war and a rhetorician attempts to persuade you to fight your enemies on horseback, but neither one of them knew what a horse was, but the person being convinced thinks a horse is a donkey, and Phaedrus responds that that would be ridiculous, which proves that rhetoric without truth is not an art at all. And so to be good at rhetoric, you must know the truth. Knowing the truth will help you to better persuade people. And he adds, Socrates: well then, isn't the rhetorical art, taken as a whole, a way of directing the soul by means of speech? The idea of rhetoric, or speaking as a way of directing the soul, also explains Julian's contempt for psychologists.
I remember about 15 years ago, before they built the new science building, they had to stick some of the counselors up here. This one psychologist liked to leave her door open, thought it gave things a friendly feeling. "Good morning," she'd say to Julian whenever he walked past her door. "Have a nice day." Can you believe that Julian phoned Channing Williams, my wicked predecessor, and threatened to quit unless she was moved? He chuckled. "That dreadful woman." That's what he called her. "I can't bear that dreadful woman accosting me every time I happen to walk by."
Not only does that explain his contempt for psychologists, but it also explains why he's like Dionysus, in that he directs the souls of his students. Continuing on, rhetoric is used in law courts by opposing sides. They both argue for and against a proposition. So, in essence, what they're doing is they're both trying to make a proposition appear either true or false. Socrates goes even further than this. Socrates: we can therefore find the practice of speaking on opposite sides not only in the law courts and in the assembly, rather it seems that one single art, if of course it is an art in the first place, governs all speaking. By means of it, one can make out as similar anything that can be so assimilated to everything to which it can be made similar, and expose anyone who tries to hide the fact that that is what he is doing. Phaedrus: what do you mean by that? Socrates: I think it will become clear if we look at it this way. Where is deception most likely to occur? Regarding things that differ much or things that differ little from one another? Phaedrus: regarding things that differ little. Socrates: at any rate, you are more likely to escape detection as you shift from one thing to its opposite if you proceed in small steps rather than in large ones. Socrates tells us that you're more likely to escape detection in your deception if you tell small lies instead of big lies. He continues further. Therefore, if you are to deceive someone else, and to avoid deception yourself, you must know precisely the respects in which things are similar and dissimilar to one another. We've said earlier that Julian's purpose within the novel is to teach the children of the elite. From this reading of the Phaedrus, I think we learn the test is to become true rhetoricians, those who are knowledgeable, who know the truth and can speak convincingly enough to deceive others and avoid being detected. That being said, it's time I talked about a new theory I came up with. The note that Julian received from Bunny wasn't written by Bunny at all. We've already pointed out the inconsistency of the murder details. Henry tells us Bunny said it was November 10th when the farmer died. On the newspaper clipping Charles found in Bunny's room, it said that it was November 12th. In the confessional note from Bunny to Julian asking him for help, he says that it happened in October. During the time when Julian tells Francis and Richard about the note, we learn something very interesting.
Well, "The secretary from the Literature and Languages Division was just here," he said. "She had a letter for me. They have in and out boxes, you know, in the literature office. One can leave things to be typed or pick up messages there, though I never do. Anyone with whom I have the slightest wish to talk knows to reach me here. This letter," he indicated it, lying open on the table beside his reading glasses, "which was meant for me, somehow wound up in the box of a Mr. Morse, who apparently is on sabbatical. His son came round to pick up his mail this morning, and found it had been put by mistake into his father's slot." "What kind of letter?" said Francis, leaning closer. "Who's it from?" "Bunny," Julian said. A bright knife of terror plunged through my heart. We stared at him, dumbstruck. Julian smiled at us, allowing a dramatic pause for our astonishment to blossom to the full. "Well, of course, it's not really from Edmund," he said. "It's a forgery, and not a very clever one. The thing is typewritten, and there's no signature or date. That doesn't seem quite legitimate, does it?" Francis had found his voice. "Typewritten," he said. "Yes. Bunny didn't own a typewriter," said Francis. "Well," said Julian, "he was my student for nearly 4 years, and he never handed anything typewritten to me." "It's terribly sad that someone would want to play a trick like this," Julian said. "I can't imagine who would do such a thing." "How long had it been in the mailbox?" Francis said. "Do you know?" "Well, that's another thing," Julian said. "It might have been put in at any time. The secretary said that Mr. Morse's son hadn't been to check his father's box since March, which means, of course, that it might have been slipped in yesterday." He indicated the envelope on the table. "You see, there's only my name, typewritten, on the front, no return address, no date, of course no postmark. Obviously it's the work of a crank. The thing is, though, I can't imagine why anyone would play such a cruel joke. I'd almost like to tell the dean, though goodness knows I don't want to stir things up again after all that fuss."
I have 2 theories. The first is that Charles wrote the note. He, being jealous of the relationship between Camilla and Henry, forges the note in an attempt to destroy Henry. But this theory is wrong for 2 reasons. Charles knew that they handed in assignments in handwriting, so he knew it wouldn't be believed by Julian that the note was authentic. The second reason is that Charles actually happens to be really good at forgery.
Charles had a rather startling talent for forgery, which, according to Camilla, dated from early childhood. Expert report card signatures by the 4th grade, entire excuse notes by the 6th.
It doesn't make sense that Charles typewrites the note when he can just forge the note in handwriting. So who wrote the note? Julian wrote it. If Bunny did write the note, he wrote the note during winter break, which gives us a time of 1 to 2 months for the letter to be delivered to Julian. But the letter didn't arrive before March, and Bunny supposedly wrote the note in or before February. At the latest February, but what is most likely is sometime in January. In either case, the note is late to be delivered. What are the chances of the note being delivered late and delivered to the wrong address? I'd wager that the probability is quite low, unless of course you're using FedEx. I admit that the evidence isn't particularly strong, but maybe the following will persuade you. The box that the letter was dropped in belonged to a teacher who's on sabbatical, and his name is Mr. Morse, as in Morse code, the communication method used to send encoded messages. You may wonder, how do you explain the piece of paper that comes from Excelsior in Rome? Well, do you remember when Henry tells Richard what happened after Bunny had read his diary at a cafe?
One afternoon at a cafe, he was going on, and I noticed that a man at the next table was hanging on every word. We got up to leave. He got up too. I wasn't sure what to think. I knew he was German because I'd heard him talking to the waiter, but I had no idea if he had any English, or if he'd been able to hear Bunny distinctly enough to understand. Perhaps he was only a homosexual, but I didn't want to take any chances.
I led the way home through the alleys, turning this way and that, and I felt quite certain we'd lost him, but apparently not, because when I woke up the next morning and looked out the window, he was standing by the fountain. Bunny was elated. He thought it was just like a spy picture. He wanted to go out and see if this fellow would try to follow us, and I had practically to restrain him by force. All morning I watched from the window. The German stood around, had a few cigarettes, and drifted away after a couple of hours. But it wasn't until about 4 o'clock, when Bunny, who'd been complaining steadily since noon, began to raise such a ruckus that we finally went to get something to eat. But we were only a few blocks from the piazza when I thought I saw the German again, walking behind us at quite a distance. I turned and started back, in hopes of confronting him. He disappeared, but in a few minutes I turned around, and he was there again.
My theory is that this German fellow actually works for Julian, and he's the one that acquired that piece of paper from Excelsior. Francis and Richard, shortly after the discovery of the note, try to steal it, but they fail. Later, Richard tries to warn Henry, but Julian discovers it.
I darted my eyes at the letter, then at Henry. He understood in an instant, turned smooth but fast. But he wasn't fast enough, and in that split second, Julian looked down, casually, just an afterthought, but a second too soon. I do not like to think about the silence that followed. Julian leaned over and looked at the letterhead for a long time. Then he picked up the page and examined it. Excelsior. Via Veneto. Blue-inked battlements. I felt curiously light and empty-headed. Julian put on his glasses and sat down. He looked through the whole thing, very carefully, front and back. I heard kids laughing faintly somewhere outside. At last he folded the letter and put it in the inside pocket of his jacket. "Well," he said at last. "Well, well, well." As is true of most incipient bad things in life, I had not really prepared myself for this possibility. And what I felt, standing there, was not fear or remorse, but only terrible, crushing humiliation, a dreadful red-faced shame I hadn't felt since childhood. And what was even worse was to see Henry, and to realize that he was feeling the same thing, and, if anything, more acutely than myself. I hated him, was so angry I wanted to kill him, but somehow I was not prepared to see him like that. Nobody said anything. Dust motes floated in a sunbeam. I thought of Camilla at the Albemarle, Charles in the hospital, Francis waiting trustfully in the car. "Julian," said Henry, "I can explain this." "Please do," said Julian. His voice chilled me to the bone. Though he and Henry had in common a distinct coldness of manner, sometimes, around them, the temperature seemed almost to drop. I had always thought Henry's coldness essential, to the marrow, and Julian's only a veneer for what was, at bottom, a warm and kind-hearted nature. But the twinkle in Julian's eye, as I looked at him now, was mechanical and dead. It was as if the charming theatrical curtain had dropped away, and I saw him for the first time as he really was. Not the benign old sage, the indulgent and protective good parent of my dreams, but ambiguous, a moral neutral, whose beguiling trappings concealed a being watchful, capricious, and heartless. Henry started to talk. It was so painful to hear him, Henry, stumble over his words that I'm afraid I blocked out much of what he said. He began, in typical fashion, by attempting to justify himself, but that soon faltered in the white glare of Julian's silence. Then, I still shuddered to remember it, a desperate, pleading note crept into his voice. "I disliked having to lie, of course." Disliked, as if he were talking about an ugly necktie, a dull dinner party. "We never wanted to lie to you, but it was necessary. That is, I felt it was necessary. The first matter was an accident. There was no use in worrying you about it, was there? And then with Bunny,
He wasn't a happy person in those last months. I'm sure you know that. He was having a lot of personal problems with his family. He went on and on. Julian's silence was vast, arctic. A black buzzing noise echoed in my head. I can't stand this, I thought. I've got to leave. But still Henry talked, and still I stood there, and the sicker and blacker I felt to hear Henry's voice and to see the look on Julian's face. Unable to stand it, I finally turned to go. Julian saw me do it. Abruptly, he cut Henry off. "That's enough," he said. There was an awful pause. I stared at him. This is it, I thought, with a kind of fascinated horror. He won't listen anymore. He doesn't want to be left alone with him. Julian reached into his pocket. The expression on his face was impossible to read. He took the letter out and handed it to Henry. "I think you'd better keep this," he said. He didn't get up from the table. The two of us left his office without a word. Funny when I think about it now. That was the last time I ever saw him.
Just like his interview with the FBI, he falters. This was Henry's test to evade detection, and like a true rhetorician, try to convince Julian that the letter is a forgery, but he fails. By implication, they all fail the test, and they fail because of their fatal flaws. Everyone has a fatal flaw, not just Richard. For example, Henry's fatal flaw is that he's too abstract.
That's his way. See, his mind doesn't work the same way yours and mine do. He's always up in the clouds with Plato or something. Works too hard, takes himself too seriously, studying Sanskrit and Coptic and those other nutty languages.
And
he brushed the dirt from his hands. But then it changed, he said, the night I killed that man. I was jarred, a little spooked as well, at so blatant a reference to something referred to, by mutual agreement, almost exclusively with codes, catchwords, 100 different euphemisms. It was the most important night of my life, he said calmly. It enabled me to do what I've always wanted most. Which is, I said, to live without thinking.
One thing we do know is that he's extremely smart. He isn't dumb as this picture expresses. He's just too stuck in his head to see what's directly in front of him, to think on his feet, to let his intuition and instinct take over. And I think his short-sightedness in the book is further symbolic of that. He misses the trees for the forest. To be sure, Henry was the leader, but his team also failed him. For example, Camilla failed him because of her fatal flaw. Her fatal flaw is narcissism. She's narcissistic because, as Frances tells us, she leads on Richard as well as makes Charles jealous. Charles's fatal flaw is obviously his jealousy. Why do I think she's narcissistic? Because of the fact that she has an incestuous relationship with her twin brother. Is there anything more narcissistic than making love with someone that looks exactly like yourself? As she looks upon his face in the throes of passion, shall we say, she doesn't see him, she sees herself, her mirrored reflection in the same vein as Narcissus falling in love with his reflection upon the water. If she hadn't been so narcissistic and made Charles jealous of Henry, Henry could have been under less stress throughout the test. The reason why Henry tries to kill Charles is not because of his jealousy of Charles, but because if it hadn't been for Charles's antics, he wouldn't have been distracted from the test. While we're on the topic of twincest, I think incest has a purpose. Marrying within one's family as opposed to outside of one's family acts as a mechanism to retain power in the family. An example of this would be the marriage between Cleopatra and her much younger brother Ptolemy XIII. He was 11 and she was 21 or 22. Earlier, I disagreed with the theory that Julian is a groomer. But Henry took 19 classes with Julian. He is a groomer, but he was grooming Henry to rule the world, and he failed. Let's hear the last words that were heard from Julian.
I have not laid eyes on Julian since that last afternoon with Henry, in his office. Frances, with extraordinary difficulty, managed to get in touch with him a couple of days before Henry's funeral. He said that Julian greeted him cordially, listened politely to the news of Henry's demise, then said, I appreciate it, Francis. But I'm afraid there's really nothing more that I can do.
If you're like most people, when you were a student, you've asked the teacher for an extension, to retake a test, or resubmit an essay or report. In this passage, doesn't Julian seem reminiscent of a teacher who denies such a request? They've received an F and there's no second chances. Previously, I've said that if we know what the test is, we can figure out what the education is. Given all of this, I think it's now time to answer that question. But first, we have to turn to another Platonic dialogue, Protagoras. Protagoras was explicitly mentioned by Socrates in the Phaedrus, but who was Protagoras?
Despite the fact that none of his works survive, Protagoras of Abdera, who lived from 490 to 420 BC, is one of the most important and controversial thinkers in the history of philosophy, and I hope tonight we'll see why he's important and why he's controversial. So, unfortunately, again, since his works don't survive, scholars are saddled with the task of unpacking his ideas from a relatively short list of surviving quotations. And as you can see in passage 1 and 2, we see two of his most famous quotations known as fragments here. Quotation number 1, we're told that his book on the gods began concerning the gods. I can't say whether they exist or they don't exist. It's a difficult question and life is short. Passage number 2, his most famous surviving quotation, the human being is the measure of all things. The things that are, that they are, and the things that are not, that they are not. Now, these are very densely packed passages, so just the task of trying to figure out exactly what he's referring to from such short passages. Fortunately, we also have a much longer passage known as the Great Speech, which runs for 8 pages in the original Greek text and appears in one of Plato's works called the Protagoras, no name for Protagoras. Now, scholars often disagree about subtle points, but in the case of interpreting Protagoras' ideas, the differences could not be more profound. Let's look at this in 2 passages. For thousands of years, Protagoras was dismissed as a fraud, as an intellectual fraud, and this is indicated in passage number 3 from the 2nd century historian Gellius. Gellius writes, this Protagoras was no philosopher at all, right? For charging a great fee, he would teach his students to manipulate truth rather than to seek truth, to make the weaker speech defeat the stronger. Sometimes people refer to the ancient sophists like the modern law school and learning to manipulate truth, learning to manipulate arguments rather than to pursue the truth. In contrast, in more recent scholarship, there's been a whole reassessment of Protagoras, and this is represented in passage number 4 from George Grote, the 19th century British historian. And look at what Grote says. Grote says, from the dialogue, and we're going to talk about this dialogue tonight, this is where the Great Speech comes from, it's clear that Plato doesn't see Protagoras as corrupt, unworthy, or incompetent. And by implication, Grote seems to suggest if Plato didn't think of him as corrupt, we shouldn't think of him as corrupt. Now wait a minute. If you compare those 2 passages, Gellius says this guy is completely corrupt. Grote says he's not corrupt. And this paradox, this dilemma, this contradiction between these 2 radically divergent interpretations of Protagoras is what motivates my scholarship, my research on his ideas. How could it be that when scholars are drawing on the same text, they have such divergent views? Protagoras had 2 sets of teaching, as we'll see in a minute. A public teaching that promoted morality, which is where Grote gets his idea from, but also a secret teaching. And we're going to see by an examination of his great speech in tonight's lecture how he uses esoteric rhetoric to let those in the know in the secret teaching, even in the public discourse. Socrates warns us in passage number 5 there that we should be careful because in his own day, Socrates says all of Greece was deceived by Protagoras. For more than 40 years, the whole time Protagoras was teaching, his whole career, Socrates says he swindled all of Greece. He charged great fees, took students under his tutelage and left them, Socrates says, worse than when he took them, right? All the time claiming to teach them about ethics and morality and make them better people. And then in the most interesting passage, passage number 6, that sparks my research, Socrates reveals something very interesting. How did he perpetuate this deception? Socrates says, by the graces, passage number 6, this Protagoras, a very wise man, uttered this dark statement, this dark saying to the common herd, like ourselves, the public teaching, right? But then told the truth in secret to his students. Let's turn to passage 11. Protagoras himself indicates what he's up to. He says that this art of sophistry practices a certain kind of teaching that incurs odium if one were to know its true ideas, and thus those who practice sophistry disguise it behind a decent dress. And thus, in the passage number 7, we see Socrates returning to this image of dressing up the truth or hiding the truth or disguising the truth. Later on, after the great speech, Socrates then questions Protagoras and he says, just like the doctor asks the patient to disrobe so that he can examine him, he says, Protagoras, expose some more of your ideas. Take off the dressing, the disguise, the nice outer covering so that we can see what you're really up to.
We can already see the similarities between Protagoras and Julian. The first is that he charges great sums of money for teaching his students and leading them astray. The second is that they both use esoteric language, and we see this numerous times throughout the book. The third is that just like Julian is surrounded by all sorts of seemingly contradictory assessments of him, so too is Protagoras. And fourth, Julian, as I may remind you, doesn't accept payment for teaching, just like Socrates, but we are told he's rich. In fact, I can give more evidence for this. When Richard is talking to George Laforgue about joining Julian's class, we are told that Julian doesn't accept payment for his teaching position.
He is a special case. He has taught here for many years, and even refuses payment for his work. Why? He is a wealthy man. He donates his salary to the college, though he accepts, I think, $1 a year for tax purposes.
And this is reminiscent of what we are told by Plato through Donna Tartt.
Because I thought it would have been more like what the Greeks had if they fell in love with Julian. I mean, that would...
Well, in a way, they all do. I mean, they do love Julian. I mean, that's part of the effect that's why Julian has such a hold over them. I mean, and which is certainly Socrates' effect upon his pupils. They love him. That's why they'll do anything for him and work really very hard. And and sit up all night when they want to go to sleep. And so I mean that's a very Greek idea that we learn better from someone, we love. Also the idea, very Greek idea that we learn by imitation, by imitating the good around us we see. What they're imitating is just a false good. They think it's a good. Something else that Plato says is that the really evil man is an evil man who has the appearance of being good, that this is true evil. Because a really evil man who manifests himself as being evil in the world, who's obviously evil, is sort of a warning light. He's sort of a beacon to warn, because we, as the Greeks thought, we wouldn't do wrong if we knew it was wrong. We all try to do the good as we see it, but some of us are deluded, and that's why that's where evil comes from.
Before we move into the dialogue, let me give you some context. In the Protagoras claims to teach his students virtue in exchange for great sums of wealth. Socrates takes the position that ethics can't be taught, and Protagoras disagrees. Socrates gives us the example of the sons of great men like Pericles. They try to raise good sons, but it doesn't always work. So, Socrates says that knowledge of good or virtue isn't something you can learn. In response, Protagoras attempts to refute Socrates by beginning with a story.
So here's how the story goes. Once upon a time, a long time ago, Protagoras envisions a time before there were living creatures, when all that existed were the gods. He appeals to the ancient gods of mythology. Protagoras, again, writing and speaking and teaching in the 5th century BC, is appealing to the old gods that Homer and Hesiod and all the other poets had discussed. And he says that when the living creatures, all the different living creatures were in the womb of the earth, the gods formed them, shaped their bodies, but then entrusted the Titan deities, particularly Epimetheus and Prometheus, to distribute various attributes that would allow each species to survive. And so Epimetheus, the Titan deity, distributes various traits to the living species. Each one he gives a different trait that would allow it to survive. Some he gave, strong claws. Some he gave a thick coat of fur. Some he allowed to be fast, like the jaguar. Some could fly away, right? The little tiny bird can just fly away and isn't frightened of the lion. And yet, saving the best for last, right? He waited and to distribute everything, saving the best for last. He finally got to human beings, and he ran out of resources. He spent all his resources and ended up with a big debt on his credit card, ended up with nothing left in his bag of tricks to give to mankind. And so his brother Prometheus comes to inspect how well his brother did, and he realizes he ran out of things. And Prometheus says, man is naked, all right? Unbedded, unshod, shelterless, right? We'd freeze to death without some sort of trait to preserve our survival. And so Prometheus comes up with an idea. Here's his great idea. He says maybe humans could use something that the gods possess. And so what did Prometheus do? He goes to the craftsman god, Hephaestus, and steals the knowledge of the arts, along with fire. He steals from Athena, the goddess of wisdom, and the craftsman god Hephaestus, knowledge of the productive arts and fire that you can use to fashion things. And so now human beings were provided with the ability to build shelter, to build, fashion weapons, to fight off the animals. Now they're no longer fearing the lion and the tiger and the bear and so on and so forth. They can build a little fence around them and make a nice zoo. But Prometheus, as good of a thief as he was, couldn't get into the citadel of Zeus. Zeus was protecting, of all things, justice, and this would be an important trait, because while humankind could now build shelter and, again, build weapons, now they were fighting with each other in the cities. And so they fought off the forces of nature, but without a knowledge of politics and ethics, mankind was at a loss. And it's at this point in the story that Zeus, who was at first protecting justice, now decides to intervene into human history and to bring justice to mankind. And Hermes, the messenger god, asks him, how should I distribute this knowledge of politics, knowledge of how to get along, knowledge of laws and ethics? Should I distribute it like other kinds of knowledge? In other words, not everyone in Houston needs to be an electrician. We can rely on some percentage of the population being electricians and plumbers and doctors. But Zeus, in one of the most important lines in all of Western history, declares, no, let all have a share. This is passage number 14. Let all have a share. Cities could not survive if this knowledge of justice was only given to a few. And make thereto a law of my ordaining, that who cannot respect and right shall die the death as a public pest, as a menace.
Protagoras then gives the rationale behind the story. His point is that ethics can be taught because at one time humans didn't possess virtue and at a later time they acquired it. He gives us the example of the law. What happens when someone commits a crime? Well, they face punishment and they learn not to do it again. That's what all ethics boils down to. But, as we're soon to find out, Protagoras contradicts himself.
Okay, so now let's begin to deconstruct what we just read. That's the public teaching. Ethics can be taught. That sounds very, as Groth says, very moralistic, very good, very ethical, right? But if we think about it and compare passage 14 and passage 15, we see there's a blatant contradiction there. Passage 14 suggested virtue is innate, God-given. But in passage 15, he's very clear. Ethics are only instilled in people by, unfortunately, in his case, by beating it into them, right? And that people innately are not so ethical. In fact, what was the saving grace that Prometheus did to save humanity? He stole, right? So our innate tendency that we need for our survival is stealing. That brings us to examination of his appeal to the gods, right? Because Protagoras appeals to the gods, which makes him seem, again, in his public discourse, like a good, orthodox pagan. If we look at Grote, again, passage number 12, he says, from this it looks like Protagoras is a very religious guy. But let's go back to passage number 1. What does Protagoras tell us about his religious beliefs outside of the myth? Concerning the gods, I can't say, even if they exist or not. It's a difficult question, and life is short. In other words, maybe I shouldn't waste my time with something that can't be proved. Moreover, let's examine how his gods serve as models, right? If we're to be like God, if that's the idea in every religious view, let's see how well his gods do in displaying the various ethics. Again, the whole point of his speech here is to teach people about ethics and morality. Protagoras identifies 3 core virtues he speaks of: justice, moderation, and holiness. Justice, giving to each what's owed; moderation, not eating too much, not drinking too much, right? And holiness, respecting the divine. But again, the story began with Epimetheus being immoderate, squandering his resources, not setting a budget, not saving something for mankind. And in terms of justice and holiness, right? What did Prometheus do? He stole. That's not law-abiding. That's not just. And moreover, whom did he steal from? From the other gods. That doesn't sound very holy. Right? So his gods violate his very rules. That said, we should note, in spite of Prometheus's transgressions, he does exhibit 2 virtues that Protagoras conveniently forgot about. Right? Prometheus, whose name literally means pro-metis in Greek, to think ahead, to see ahead, he saw what human beings would need, displays great wisdom. And moreover, his brazenness, his bravery in breaking into Athena and Hephaestus's dwellings to steal these goods shows his courage. Oh, Socrates questions Protagoras, aren't these virtues too, bravery and courage? You forgot about these? Now Protagoras says, oh yeah, those are virtues too, and in fact wisdom is the most important one. Well, one scholar, which brings us to passage 16, takes note of this forgetfulness on Protagoras' part. It's not a small point that he forgot. Hemingway here notes how this shows 2 different sets of virtue. Demotic virtue, demotic meaning virtue for the many, he says, is this kind of restraint and law-abidingness. Again, what we see in moderation and justice, that the many people, you guys should behave yourself. Right? But then, what we see in Prometheus's actions, Hemingway identifies as elite virtue, a kind of virtue for a few. Wink, wink. Right? Be brave, be daring, be courageous, and be cunning and wise and clever, to be beyond the law. And thus the gods of Protagoras' myth stand outside the law they impose for others.
This is the education of our heroes. The secret teaching is going beyond the law, and we see this in the Bacchae.
So it's a demonstration, really, of enormous cosmic power on the part of the god. It simply, as one of the characters, Cadmus, says at the end, it's simply too much. It's just, but it's too much.
It's just, but it's too much. So in essence, it's beyond what is just. And we see this manifested throughout the book as well, with references to Plotinus, who famously said in the Aeneid that evils in this world aren't really evil, and that death or murder is akin to actors in a play who, once they pass away on stage, come back at a later time in a different dress. Donna Tartt makes a reference to Nietzsche before the prologue, who of course is someone who was a nihilist, that rejected the existence of a transcendent god or the good, just like Protagoras. wouldn't you agree that the manner in which Nietzsche died is akin to the madness brought upon by Dionysus? In fact, isn't that what the irrational is? The irrational was mentioned in the first lesson that Richard had with Julian. And like I said, I don't believe this book is Dionysian. The irrational is the rejection of mind-independent or objective truth, reason, and goodness. It is the position of those things being constructions by the human mind, in the spirit of Protagoras, who said that man is the measure of all things. There are multiple references to this elsewhere, such as the time Richard was reading the Parmenides for homework. And of course, in that dialogue, there's a conversation between young Socrates and Parmenides, a philosopher who affirmed that everything that we see around us is an illusion. This is the true theme of the book. The book is not Platonic, it's not Dionysian, it's Protagorean. At the beginning of this video, I warned you that knowing this will get you disappeared. And the reason why knowing this would get you disappeared is because in the Bacchae, seeing the mysteries gets you killed, as Semele, the mother of Dionysus, asks to see Zeus in all his glory. She dies from seeing what no mortal can see. Or the fact that Pentheus, who is not a Maenad or a follower of Dionysus, inquires into the mysteries that goes on, and he is subsequently killed. So, where is Julian now? I think he's looking for a new student to teach. Thank you for watching. Please leave a like and subscribe to Classic Literature and Philosophy for more videos. If you like this video, then I think you'd like my video on the picture of Dorian Gray, revealing the secret behind that book. If you disagree with anything I've said or want to contribute to the conversation, please leave a comment in the comment section below. Have a nice day.